This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to our webinar, which is co-organized by IUCN and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences under the Envision project. My name is Marie Fischborn. I work for IUCN at the Global Protected Areas program. We're very much looking forward to an interesting session and to your inputs. We've had 102 registrations for this webinar, which is a great indication of interest, and it's wonderful to see many of you online. If at any point during the webinar you have a question or a comment, please feel free to type it in the chat box, and we're going to address these during the Q&A part towards the end. So in your GoToMeeting control panel, you have the chat, and just send a message with your question or comment to everyone, and we'll then pick those up in the end. If you encounter any technical issues, feel free to message me in private in the chat box as well. So just address your message to Marie Fischborn, and I will see that. Or if that doesn't work for some reason, just send me an email under the email address on the slide here. Alberto, next slide, please. Thank you. And if everybody could please switch off their videos. We're not going to use video during this session. Thank you. So a quick overview of today's agenda. We're going to start with a brief introduction on the principal importance of protected areas, as well as an overview of the policy landscape in the European Union, as well as in the United States, some of the challenges in relation to that. We're going to look at progress towards global biodiversity targets and the global policy arena more generally. And all of this is going to be the framing to then introduce and discuss this concept of inclusive conservation in the context or in relation to the Envision project. So this is going to take us about 20 minutes, and we'll then move into hopefully lively discussion with our presenters who are going to address the questions that you have submitted. And we're going to close at around 5:45. So to quickly introduce our presenters today, we have Alberto Arroyo Schnell from IUCN. He's a senior policy manager at our European regional office in Brussels. We will also hear from Professor Christopher Raymond of the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. He's a guest professor there, and he is also the coordinator of the Envision project. And we also have on the line Dr. Veronica Lowe, who will not be presenting, but who will be available to likewise address the comments and questions at the end. And Veronica is the manager of Envision, the project manager, and she's likewise at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. So without further ado, let me hand over to Alberto, who should now be able to speak.
Yes, thank you, Marie. Thank you, Marie, and thank you for all our listeners. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people from all over the world here today. Well, what you have in front of you now is a picture of a Spanish national park, the Sierra de Guadarrama. These are my mountains. I was born not far away from here, and this is one of the areas where we are working in this Envision project, and one of the reasons I am very excited to be part of this project that is focused on the emerging concept on inclusive conservation. But before we go into the project, we would like to provide you with a short introduction about the policy context, as Marie was telling us before. And this starts with protected areas, or better said, with their achievements to date, because protected areas have achieved the biggest global surface dedicated to a common goal, covering close to 15% of the global land and inland waters, and over 10% of the coastal and marine areas. We know the benefits of these areas in terms of services, food, clean water supply, how they are also helping to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Now, if we focus in the European part, please note that we are going to focus on Natura 2000, or the biggest joint EU effort to protect nature, with over 27,000 sites at the moment, and based on common legislation for 28 countries, the nature directives, that created Natura 2000, that is currently covering 18% of the land area and 9% of the marine. This is covering the first part of the Aichi Target 11. That means that by 2020, it will be achieved in the European Union. The second part, though, the effective management, well, we are still far from getting there. Now, focusing in the United States, according to the World Database on Protected Areas of the UNEP WCMC, the protected areas in the United States currently are covering 13% of the terrestrial area and over 41% of the marine area. The recent National Park Service call to action from 2016, the plan for the next century, is focusing on preserving special places that encompass the biological and cultural diversity of North America, the protected areas. This is also joined with the concept of healthy parks, healthy people, the notion that all parks are cornerstones of people's physical, mental, and spiritual health, as well as the social well-being and sustainability of the planet. Now, we have some challenges. In particular, in the European Union, many of the Natura 2000 sites are still without a management plan, or the ones that have a management plan, the implementation of this management plan is still lagging behind. Furthermore, the recent EU Action Plan for Nature, People and the Economy identified the need to enhance the implementation of the EU nature directives, including building political ownership and strengthening compliance. In the United States, the challenges are also related with the still not complete management of all protected areas, but also the current administration has recently weakened the endangered species legislation to reduce protection for listed species. It has also reduced the size of some protected areas, in some cases over 80%. This is the largest reduction in protected areas in the nation's history. It is also relevant to mention that the US government has not appointed yet a new director to the National Park Services since the previous one's retirement in 2017. All this, of course, is not helping the achievement of our global goals. In the European Union, the EU Biodiversity 2010 target was not achieved at the time, and we have strong indications that we are not going to achieve the 2020 target. In the US, not party of the CBD, we cannot say that the effective management of all protected areas has been completed. And from a global perspective, of course, we all are familiar with the results of the recent IPBES study, highlighting the catastrophic decline of biodiversity unprecedented in human history. In the global policy arena, you know that the Convention on Biological Diversity adopted the strategic framework on biodiversity and associated set of Aichi biodiversity targets in 2010. And Target 11 in particular aimed to protect 17% of terrestrial and inland water ecosystems and 10% of marine ecosystems by 2020. Now we are getting to the end of this strategic plan. As the targets will expire, a post-2020 global biodiversity framework is currently under development, and this will include a new set of targets. And as with the strategic plan currently in place, this new framework will inform and will influence national and regional policy development, including also for protected areas. It can also be foreseen that there will be a special focus on implementation, as this has been still a challenge in relation with protected areas. This will include the newly created protected areas and, of course, the existing ones. And this is where the concept of inclusive conservation comes in. Chris will tell you more about this concept in a moment. But for now, see here the current definition, which is still work in progress, and refers to accommodating and balancing different visions for achieving socially relevant, economically productive, and environmentally sustainable outcomes. With the Envision project, we aim to demonstrate the benefits of inclusive conservation. We are following a very practical approach. We are trying to interface with policymakers through the development of knowledge alliances that enhance our connection to such policymakers. Actually, our project timeline aligns quite well with the development of the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So we will engage in discussions in the lead up to and following the adoption of this framework, for which IUCN, for which I am also working, will be very helpful. We are a key partner in this project, and we have a global reach and connection to policy processes and communications platforms that will help in this purpose. One example in this regards is connecting to Panorama Solutions, where we will feature case studies of our work and particular building blocks of success. We will also develop policy briefs, fact sheets, and host meetings with policymakers in Brussels and elsewhere to disseminate the results. And with this, I hand over you to Chris, who will tell you more details about inclusive conservation and the Envision project. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and welcome to everyone. As Alberto mentioned, I'm going to talk more in depth about this inclusive approach to assessing integrative scenarios and visions for protected area management. Next slide. Many of you may know, and as Alberto alluded to, there are a range of pressures facing protected areas, including climate change, mining, new governance arrangements, pressures on water resources and water resource planning, new forms of invasive species, land use change, including urbanisation, tourism, and indigenous use of natural resources, right through to forestry, etc. The next slide. But a recent fitness check, as Alberto mentioned, as well as a range of policy documents from the United States, have revealed multi-level challenges. Protected areas are lacking support among local and national governments. There's low stakeholder awareness of protected area benefits and low stakeholder involvement in their conservation. And importantly, there's difficulties in balancing conservation goals with economic and social drivers of change, and problems with consensus-based decision-making, recognising that there are different interests, and each interest may have different visions for how protected areas should be managed both now and into the future. Next slide. So not so recent, but back in 2014, Mace presented a paper in Science entitled Whose Conservation? And there it was outlined 4 different visions for how conservation could look into the future. Nature for people, focusing on the economic and social elements of protected areas. Nature for itself, so nature existing despite of social, economic and environmental goals. Nature despite people, which basically excludes the social elements and focuses on the environmental goals. And nature and people, which represents a more balanced view where social, economic and environmental criteria are considered equally. With each of these different visions for protected areas, we recognise that there is potential for conflicts, but there's also potential for collectively defining visions, which has been largely unexplored academically in the context of protected area management. Next slide. So in inclusive conservation, it may sound a bit idealistic, but we're looking at ways to balance multiple visions and scenarios for protected area management. So ways to look at this balancing social, economic and environmental goals. And we're going to do this through a process of collectively defining visions, resulting based upon understanding the consequences of visions for protected area management. And the science that we're going to conduct will enable us to better understand those consequences. And the goal is not only to understand the consequences of those visions, but also to better connect different types of people to protected area policies and practices, and ultimately to improve biodiversity and human well-being. Next slide. We're working in 4 areas: Denali National Park in Alaska, Västerhaga area in Östergötland in Sweden, the Sierra de Guatemala area of Spain, and the Rhine region of the Netherlands. And we can sort of see this on an urban to wilderness gradient, where Rhine near Utrecht represent more of an urban protected area. Sierra de Guatemala is a peri-urban protected area system. Vasterhaag is more agriculture and rural, and Denali is wilderness. Next slide. On the Envision website, you can read up more about our partners, but essentially we have 6 scientific partners, partner 1 being the coordinator myself from SLU. We have representatives from University of Catalonia, Stockholm University, University of Göttingen, Illinois University in the United States, Free University Amsterdam, but importantly, we have subcontracted partners of IUCN, responsible for the science policy interface, Science Seed, responsible for our communications and design work, and University of Edinburgh, which is providing high-level work, and importantly, linkage to a previous project in this area called Operas. Next slide. So the overarching mission of Envision is about improving biodiversity and human well-being through inclusive conservation. But when we look at the objective, what we're wanting to do is to develop a coherent set of tools and processes for systematically identifying, assessing, and comparing protected area management visions based upon both past drivers of change and the consequences of modelled scenarios and multiple aspects of biodiversity, ecosystems, and human well-being. So we have an emphasis on identifying, comparing, and balancing multiple protected area visions, enhancing understanding of social and ecological consequences, and making evidence-based recommendations. And we're doing that through a mixed methods participatory scenario planning approach. Next slide. This task, or this slide, essentially summarizes our tasks. So we have, at our roots, or at our trunk, should I say, we have this focus on inclusive conservation, and our approach is guided by advisory boards at the local level, which we call Intersite and Knowledge Alliance, and at cross scales, we call it the Intersite Knowledge Alliance. Then we have, as Alberto mentioned, IUCN informing biodiversity and protected area management policy. University of Göttingen is looking at how we can consider multiple visions for protected areas. VU Amsterdam is looking at using the latest techniques in biodiversity modelling to assess the ecological consequences of each vision, but they'll also be looking at some of the social consequences, including consequences for human well-being. And then those consequences are going to be brought into group-based decision-making processes, and we're going to see how individual and group visions for protected areas may change as a result of presenting them the consequences of each of these visions for protected areas. And then we recognise that there might be uncertainty associated with each of these visions, and hence we need to look at ways of assessing uncertainty and building resilience. Clearly, there's a strong power dynamic to identifying, sharing, and trying to balance visions, and hence we also want to look at how we can acknowledge power relations and rethink governance to incorporate those power relations. And that's where University of Catalonia is focusing. And SLU is, of course, looking at the whole project as coordinator of inclusive conservation. Next slide. Our website presents the more detailed methods, but essentially we are looking at a range of methods per theme. For example, assessing the consequences of each vision, we'll be using participatory scenario analysis, prioritisation models, deliberation on consequences and trade-offs, looking at mixed methods to assess the perceived drivers of change. In terms of considering multiple visions for protected areas, we're going to use this tool called Streamline, which is a cartoon-based approach to eliciting visions. We're going to look at oral history interviews, as well as social ecological inventories for understanding the relationship between different stakeholders and ecological drivers of change. Next slide. And of course, we also have method for social learning, uncertainty assessment, and acknowledging power relations. For example, we're going to administer residential surveys to understand how learning occurs, and we're going to compare understandings of the protected area management pre and post workshops to understand the learning that occurs. We've got resilience assessments through the Stockholm Resilience Centre to better understand uncertainty and to build resilience. And to acknowledge power relations, we're going to rely on social network analysis, focus groups, and semi-structured in-depth interviews. Next slide. So where's this all heading? So what does this really mean for society? Well, we recognise that we want to have a range of societal impacts, and Alberto's already alluded to the fact that we want to understand how these diverse visions for protected area management can be brought together in a way to inform EU biodiversity strategy, including follow up on the EU and birds habitats directives, EU habitats and birds directives, and the EU green infrastructure strategy. We also wanting to inform the follow up to the Healthy Parks, Healthy People initiative in the United States, and the translation of the 2011 call to action into implementation. But this is also a research project, and we foresee a number of scientific breakthroughs. Importantly, new frameworks to represent and methods for assessing the social and ecological consequences of diverse visions for protected area management, and new scientific tools for moving beyond the problems of protected area management to discussing and negotiating shared purposes and futures, with the emphasis on building confidence as opposed to reinforcing conflicts. We acknowledge there's many conflicts regarding protected area management, but how do we start to build common futures in an atmosphere of confidence as opposed to conflict? Next slide. And of course, we have this strong focus on dissemination and informing biodiversity and protected area management policy. We're going to have presentations and model actors involved in post-2020 debates. We're going to have this knowledge alliance, and we're going to facilitate learning among that alliance. So it's not just reporting to us, but we're providing insights back. We've got a link to Panorama Communications, like where this webinar is based, so that wider stakeholders and wider publics can learn about our findings. We've got business breakfasts, we've got an Envision Festival, etc. Next slide. So we're coming towards the end of our webinar, and we want to open up to some questions for you. And we recognise there's a lot to take in. And one question we would see to you, if you don't have any questions for us, is how do you think we as an Envision team could better inform current and ongoing processes regarding the development of the new EU biodiversity strategy to 2030? And probably linked to that for our US colleagues is how we can inform the implementation of the Healthy Parks, Healthy People framework in the United States. So let's open it up to some questions now, which I believe will be facilitated by Marie.
Thanks very much, Chris and Alberto. So we now move into the more interactive part of this webinar, and you saw that we put out a question to you, so you might want to share your views on that via the chat box, and we'd be very keen to hear your views. But we also have, in the meantime, a question that was submitted by Maria Lopez, I think addressed to all three speakers, Alberto, Veronica, and Chris. And she is asking, could you explain what mixed methods are? And Alberto, I think you muted yourself, so you'd need to unmute if you want to talk.
Okay. Perhaps I'll try to answer that question first and others can elaborate. So mixed methods are methods where one method tries to inform the next. It often is where qualitative research, where you try to explore and describe, informs quantitative work where you try to explain a phenomena. So to give you a better example, a qualitative work in vision may involve focus groups and interviews where we better understand different stakeholder perspectives around their visions for protected areas, which could then inform a survey questions regarding explaining those visions in a wider sample. So there is an order in the methods, recognising one can inform the next. Alberto, did you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you. Well, more than adding to the research part that you were mentioning before, I actually will be happy to come back to the question that was posed by yourself in the previous slide, in reference to how we can use the results from this project to inform the discussions about the future biodiversity strategy to 2030. At the moment, maybe you are not so familiar with that, but we are about to have a new European Commission here in place, and they are supposed to come up with a new European strategy to 2030 for biodiversity in 100 days as part of the so-called Green Deal. Well, in this moment is the perfect situation to send information about the very important need to ensure that the stakeholders' involvement is considered as one of the main conditions to ensure the success for the achievement of the biodiversity targets by 2030. So now any information that we can have at these early stages of the projects about how inclusive conservation will help to ensure that this stakeholder involvement in the management of protected areas, but also more generally for biodiversity conservation, will be extremely helpful to ensure that this is reflected as one of the needs for the future strategy to be successful.
Thank you both, and thanks Alberto for prompting the conversation a little bit further here on the question that we put out. So our participants might want to agree or disagree or expand on what you said there. But in the meantime, we have another question from Varsha Mehta. She is asking, are there any insights or experiences of inclusive conservation from developing countries which have a more complex socio-economic, political, and ecological landscape management issue, which have more complex management issues? And I think this is again addressed to all presenters potentially.
Yeah, maybe I could start there. And yes, I recognise that there are important differences in relation to how protected areas are not only managed, but the processes of engagement in the global south. And I understand that through my work in IPBES, through the development of this assessment around the multiple values of nature. In Envision, our case areas focus on the developed world, but we are looking at ways that we can start to partner with other projects in the global south, recognizing that we could have important things to learn around how do we build capacity of protected area managers, but also how do we weave together local and indigenous knowledge to inform more inclusive policies. It's hard for me, should I say, to give concrete examples from Envision because we're just starting to explore that opportunity. Anyone want to elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah. Ultimately, I guess with a framework for the inclusive conservation that we're aiming to develop and test, that there will be elements that are transferable to different contexts. I mean, when we talk about developing countries, we may also want to think, as Chris mentioned, about capacity building and local indigenous knowledge. There's also elements of gender mainstreaming that we may wish to consider, in addition to innovative ways of financing protected areas management.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris and Veronica. And we have another question by Marlene Maskley, which is somewhat related to the one we discussed just now. She's asking, how could one implement your inclusive conservation approach in a context in a developing country where there are many indigenous people living around the protected area, that have always been depending on the sources from the protected area. And I'm going to couple this with a second question, and you can perhaps address both one after the other, because we're seeing quite a few questions coming in now, which is great. So the second question is about the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Tristan Tyrrell is asking us to further explain how we are planning to engage in the process around the post-2020, considering this process is advancing relatively quickly. So how do you see the Envision initiative influencing it in a meaningful manner?
Excellent. Perhaps I'll try to address the first question. Alberto, you could try to address the second. The first question was regarding how do we see Indigenous and local people engaging with protected areas, and how do we look at this tension between supporting their quality of life and needs and conservation goals. I think to best answer that is in Envision, we acknowledge the important role of land sharing, which is this concept of that there are multiple uses and multiple needs that people have for protected areas. So it's not about excluding people, it's about looking at how their visions and how their needs can be considered in protected area management strategies. And that's certainly the starting point for a lot of the Natura 2000 sites in Europe, which have a range of existing uses and may not always have a dominant, sole focus, should I say, on conservation. But it also links into this bigger question of how do we start to balance competing needs, recognising that there will be some trade-offs when we start to balance different needs. And we're hopeful that through learning from these Global South perspectives, we can look at ways to also integrate the wealth of knowledge from those contexts. So over to you, Alberto, regarding the post-2020 question.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, you are completely right. This process is advancing quickly at the moment. Well, what we need to ensure is that in this process, where we can foresee that implementation is going to be one of the crucial issues, because as we know very well, and it's not difficult to define what we need to do for biodiversity. Simply, we need to make sure that it happens. There is an issue with implementation. And in this context, to ensure that things really work well, we need to ensure that we don't work alone, let's say. The conservation sector by itself will not achieve the biodiversity goals. We need to work all hand in hand. And in this context, inclusive conservation is a perfect way forward to ensure that this works for protected areas. So to ensure that this stakeholder involvement or engagement is really well reflected in the framework is one of the things that we need now to ensure. And yes, the process is advanced, but there are still good scope to ensure that this is well reflected, both at global and at European level. In the States, of course, it's a little bit different, but there are still good opportunities. And secondly, anyway, the process will not stop once the framework is defined. On the contrary, it will just start. And in that moment, the implementation again will be crucial. And again, ensuring that all stakeholders are part of the discussion to ensure that conservation works is going to be crucial, and inclusive conservation, we believe, is a very good way forward to ensure it works for protected areas.
The next question comes from Bruno Smith. He is asking whether you have considered to integrate ecosystem service accounting techniques in order to quantify the pressure and enforce the impact in protecting national parks and the biodiversity within them.
Yes, that's a core component of Work Package 2, where we're going to use ecosystem service modelling and assessment techniques to understand the synergies and trade-offs between different types of ecosystem services and human well-being. When we start to consider different scenarios, and those scenarios will be driven by different community visions for protected areas. But we want to move beyond MACE frameworks or the mapping and assessment of ecosystem services to start to look at this bigger question, which is now in the interest of IPBES, which is how do we start to include a range of other values and worldviews into conservation, recognising that at least initially when the ecosystem service concept was being developed, it had certain types of values and worldviews in mind, e.g. a strong focus on biophysical assessments and economic values, but there's this increasing focus on relational values and social cultural values through more recent scholarship. And we're certainly wanting to find ways to bring those wider values into the modelling process, which is a scientific advancement we hope to make. Yeah,
Thanks.
I hope that, yeah.
The next question comes from Tenzin, who is describing a complex situation in the Kailash sacred landscape between China, Nepal, and India, which is outside the intervention area of Envision, but he's nevertheless asking whether the project could help in this regard. So the situation is that this landscape is being nominated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for both cultural and natural values, and that the 3 states inevitably dominate the agenda, defining all aspects of the landscape to suit their needs. For example, only a small number of Tibetans are included in the nomination, I understand. So the issue of development is a key objective for all 3 states, and I'm trying to summarize a little bit the very elaborate description of the situation. The largely Tibetan districts have been deeply disrupted by the imposition of sovereign state territorialized boundaries, making the human communities isolated, remote, and poor. And it has become inevitable that development takes the priority over conservation, while conservation is still being used as a marketing message.
Yeah, wow, very intricate question. And I think what this is reflecting is some of the politics around protected area management, particularly at cross borders. And one of the things that we are trying to challenge in Envision is this dominant worldview where, which pervades a lot of, at least commercial decision making, which is this view of living from nature, where we see nature as something, as a resource or something that to be developed or extracted from. And we need to start to look at alternative visions, which includes earlier work around this concept of living in nature, where we recognise the benefits of conservation to a broader range of well-being values. Then the question that emerges is, well, how do you actually get policymakers and others and politicians to really understand that their importance? And I acknowledge there's no very easy solutions to that question, but I'm a great believer in part of it. It revolves around deliberative democracy and finding new ways that you can bring the science into those deliberative settings, so you can understand how science can inform collective decision making. And never forget, those collective decisions do at various levels influence political realities. So I hope that tries to address your question. It's quite a complex one, and I'd be happy to follow up with you separately. But there's a lot of things in that question. But it highlights the fact that when you start to bring together different visions, there is potential for winners, losers, and trade-offs that have to be effectively acknowledged. And we in Envision, we're trying to do that, and we're trying to take it to the next level, recognizing that there are not just multiple values and multiple understandings out there, but somehow the conflicts and synergies between these multiple values and understandings somehow have to be addressed in a deliberative decision-making context.
Thank you, Chris. And we have 2 more questions, which I'm going to read out together since we have about 5 minutes left. This question is from Tavanda Gotosa. He or she, apologies, I'm not sure, is asking, how do you see the future of protected areas in view of the pressure around competing land uses, so the multiple pressures and competing land uses that protected areas face? And the second question is being asked by Luc Janssens de Bisthoven. Is this project also tackling the difficult issue of human rights and conservation? If so, how? And what is your position on having the next CBD COP in China, a country that is massively putting a minority in camps?
Yeah. Okay, maybe Berto, you and I can both address this question. How do you see the future of protected areas? Do you want to have a go at that one first?
Yes, of course. It's a very good question. And actually, it's not that we are going to find a solution in, unfortunately, only 4 minutes from now, because it's a question that is there for a while. Now, what we believe is that having this possibility to discuss and to advance in the discussion, actually, with stakeholders, all of the different interests around a protected area, the visions, especially about how they see the future, we might try to find solutions that will benefit or will satisfy most of the stakeholders, if not all of them. This is not an easy question, and this is not going to happen just overnight, but what we are trying to develop is a methodology that will help to ensure that these kind of challenges that are facing all protected areas might be easier to address. Of course, we are a limited project, let's say. We have a number of case studies, and we are going to have some results in some years, but we are certainly sure that we will come up with some methodology that will help. I will say that even cases that are more complicated than even the one that was mentioned before in Tibet, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I'm an optimist, and I'd like to think that with this renewed urgency around issues of climate change and also issues of well-being, that there is as well as biodiversity loss, that there is a real opportunity now to bring issues relating to protected area management to the surface and at the forefront of the policy debate at different levels of decision making. The question is how, and that's what Envision is trying to address, is how do we start to bring these quite complex and nuanced discussions into the policy arena using the best available science. In relation to the human rights question, that's a very challenging question, and obviously there's a lot of politics linked to that as well. Maybe I could answer that more from my IPBES cap, which as I'm coordinating lead author of Chapter 2 of the Values Assessment. And the starting point for that is that we need to start bringing in multiple values of nature into conservation decision making, with the goal is to address entrenched issues of environmental justice and social justice more broadly. So IPBES has moved from this ecosystem service framing to nature's contribution to people in recognition of the need to incorporate more diverse voices and in order to recognise the needs and rights of Indigenous people as well as local people. But that means challenging some of the dominant worldviews and dominant ideologies that are present, not just in conservation, but in a range of sectors. It means moving from looking at resources and land as purely as something that we can extract from, to something to land which has multiple potential needs associated with it and multiple potential rights associated with it. We cannot address all those questions in Envision because it extends far beyond our scope. But what we hope to do is at least start to bring some of these different visions to the table. And for example, in the Denali case, we'll be engaging with Indigenous people and First Nations communities and better understanding how their visions can be brought into discussions around protected area management in Alaska. We also will be engaging with a range of local knowledge, people with different forms of local knowledge in each of our case study areas, so that we can better pay attention to of how different forms of knowledge can be weaved into protected area management. But again, the other questions you raised about whether China should support this, the next COP or not, I think that's I don't really want to respond to that directly, but I really think we need to, in a general level, particularly in a science level, start to engage with different, not only different types of knowledge, but different starting points around how human rights can be better integrated into protected area management.
And if I may add just the last seconds on a positive note, what Chris was saying before is fundamental. We are living times when biodiversity, interestingly enough, I would say, because I'm in this field for some decades at this point, is now on top of the agenda. You can hear at the level of prime ministers or presidents the word biodiversity in their mouth and actually promising very, very positive ways forward. So it's a very good moment to discuss about this and to find common ways forward that will help also biodiversity, which was probably not so easy only some years ago.
So if I could add to that as well, I think it's also important for us to pay attention to all of the debate going on in the lead up to and after the post 2020 framework is being established, because by inclusivity we should also consider inclusivity in terms of managing for the outcomes of biodiversity protection and ecosystem services. So that may not just include protected areas, but other effective area-based conservation measures such as indigenous community conserved areas or spatial planning or some other kinds of management mechanisms that can help with biodiversity conservation. So hopefully we can also engage in those types of discussions as well.
And with this, we're getting to the end of this webinar. I'd like to thank all the participants for joining, and particularly like to thank those who asked interesting, sometimes challenging questions on this certainly very complex topic. Thank you also to our 3 speakers. There will be a recording available of this session, which we will share with everyone who registered, including, of course, those of you who joined us today. We will also run further webinars through the Envision project, so look out for the announcements. And also, of course, we encourage you to stay engaged with the project, follow its progress, check the website, and engage with us. Thank you so much, and have a good rest of the day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.